In recent years, this particular engine has worked on the main line and has earned a reputation as a very handy machine. But in steam days, the type had a mixed reception among enginemen. They were nothing like as popular as their tank engine equivalent.
We had a couple of trips on them. I mean, they were rough riding, especially on the overrun when you were coasting. I didn't do an awful lot on them, but they had the same sort of faults as the Class 4 standard.
At least they were easy to look after. A close inspection of the running gear shows just how accessible everything was. Generations of enginemen had had to crawl around inside the frames, trying to reach components which needed daily attention. On these engines, it was all hanging out where you could see it. But what was a standard engine like to operate from a fireman's point of view? We can join the bigger 10-wheeled version on a service train on the Bluebell Railway, with the bowler-hatted fireman Phil Gain as our guide.
Very fortunate on a BR standard locomotive. Ample room on the footplate. Plenty of room to get a decent swing. Firing a locomotive is about 80% technique and 20% of knowledge. As you can see here, Bob's got an excellent movement going, just using minimal effort to propel the coal to the points where it's needed. As a rule, we'll generally put large lumps of coal like that underneath the door, which is the first point of contact with the firebox. They prevent large amounts of cold air being ripped through the bed of the fire and ultimately cooling the fire down. If your fire starts to cool and produce holes, it's not going to steam. If it doesn't make the steam, the engine stops. We build a fire up with a big heavy wedge of coal under the door. That's where the majority of the air is drawn through from the grate. That's where the majority of the heating surface starts from. The next bed of the part of the fire to be built up is around the sides of the firebox and towards the very front end. If you imagine the shape of your firebox, all the water is around the sides. You keep the back and the sides of your fire bed hot and bright all the time. It's more efficient, boils your water faster. Although you can't see it in there, there is a very good bed of fire just under the door. It is shaped like a wedge, approximately 3 feet from the aperture, sloping towards the front of the firebox. All the time the locomotive is being used and producing steam, the water is evaporating. To put water back into the boiler, we have an injector. It is a steam-powered pump that lives under the cab of the footplate. You might be able to hear it now. You can hear a singing noise, a high-pitched whine. And it's these controls here. Water is fed through from the tender, and steam is admitted, and through a restriction of restrictions and venturi in this injector, the water is forced back into the boiler barrel. This enables you to introduce fresh water to boil into the boiler, and also it cools the temperature of the water inside, very useful in the station to prevent it from blowing off. To aid the firemen as well, we've got 2 other controls that are used. They're called dampers. These wheels here allow flaps underneath the ash pan below the fire to open, and they increase the flow of air at the back of the fire or the front. The more air that comes through, the better the combustion. And this is also aided with a control that sits on the driver's side called the blower. This creates a partial vacuum inside the smoke box and helps draw the fire. It is very useful in the preparation of the locomotive in the morning and also for use in tunnels, because it will prevent what we call a blowback, which is air rushing through the chimney and back through the boiler. If that was to happen, that flame will spit out of there and come back right to the tender door. Not very nice. The driver here is being exceedingly fireman friendly. We'll notice the cut-off position on the regulator, about 40%. Notice the amount of steam that the locomotive is using. We've got 80 pounds of steam entering her cylinders, and we've got 200 pounds in the boiler. This is driving at its best. The train is doing line speed. It is being worked very economically. We've got a very thin, very hot, very efficient fire in front of us. It's wonderful. It will take very little preparation at Sheffield Park now for the engine to be made ready for its next return trip.
And then there was the 9F, the king of the British freight locomotives. In some ways, the 9F was an ugly engine. The 10 coupled wheels looked too small, the boiler looked too high, and you could see daylight in the middle. But railwaymen loved these giants with their little 5-feet wheels, especially when it slowly dawned on the railway world that they could run at 80 or even 90 miles an hour. The wildlife artist David Shepherd bought 2 standard engines from British Railways back in the 60s, and has kept one of them ever since.
To me, who owns this massive monster, Black Prince, the 50s were the most exciting time in steam locomotive development in this century, because that's when the standard locos came in, of which this is a 9F, 251 were built. They were the ultimate, and this one, my own Black Prince, I'm so bloody proud of it I can hardly speak.
David Shepherd's engine was just 8 years old when he bought her, the 17th to last engine ever built, and he's owned her now for 40 years. Most railwaymen agree with David Shepherd that the 9Fs were phenomenal machines.
I think they were. I mean, for a start off, you were driving something pretty impressive, with 10 coupled wheels, the high running plate, the big boiler. People used to call them spaceships and all sorts of funny names. You really felt that you were in charge of some lump of machinery when you took one of them out. Now, a lump of machinery is no good without the steam, and once we'd found out how to make them steam, we began to enjoy them. We never had to run them at high speed, but I understand that they would run at very high speeds with great smoothness. Despite their great huge cylinders and massive balance weights and all the rest of it, they ran really, really smoothly. I think they were a marvellous engine.
As you can see, it's big, it's full of character. For its size, I think it's probably one of the easiest locomotives that we've got to drive and fire. It's very user-friendly. Bearing in mind, when it was designed in the late 50s, it was designed to burn rubbish coal that was available. It's designed for ease of maintenance. You can get to every part of it very easily. I think it's just wonderful. And then when you're doing 25 mile an hour up the line with a 6-coach train behind you, and you get a talking coming up towards the tunnel, you'd like that.
The Great Western built the last one, Evening Star, and for a while it pulled a crack express called the Red Dragon. But then someone in authority reminded them that this was supposed to be a goods engine. When they first came out, there was much scratching of heads among BR firemen who were struggling to make them steam, and it wasn't immediately obvious what the problem was.
We were at a loss when we first got on them, to be quite honest. The first time I ran a train to Basingstoke, my fireman, a good fireman called Len Butler, was firing away in his normal manner with the fire the normal shape, and yet the engine wasn't steaming. And when we got to Woking, we realised that we were going to be in trouble. We left Woking, started climbing up the bank to milepost 31, and things got worse. And in the end, I realised that the lack of water in the boiler meant we'd have to stop while we were still pointing uphill with some depth of water at the back of the boiler. So we stopped. And we stood there in the dark, and Len said to me, "What's wrong with her, Clive? I can't make it steam." And I looked in the fire, and it looked like any other fire I'd ever seen in any Pacific. I said, "I'm bugged if I know, Len. What's wrong with it?" But we made the steam enough to carry on and got to Basingstoke. When he threw the fire out, he called me over, and he said, "Clive, look at this." When he'd shoveled out the fire, there was none in there. The fire, which was up to almost the top of the door, at times, was only a foot thick. Because the depth at the back of a 9F firebox is no deeper than your palm to your fingertips. There's no depth there. So his problem had been that he didn't have enough coal in the back of the box, even though had he had the fire at that level on any of our Pacifics, it would have been 18 inches deep. And that was the trouble. And all you had to do was fire it ridiculously high so that you could barely get coal in between the top of the door. That was the only space you had, and it would steam. So the next night I said, "Fire it ridiculously high," and he did, and it went beautifully from then on. We never had any more trouble.
In a rare moment of egalitarianism, the Nationalised Railway Board had invited engine men to help design the standard footplate layout.
The ergonomics of a 9F was pretty perfect. A bit of a climb to pull sand up onto that running plate to fill the sandboxes. That was a bit of a hike for the firemen. But from the point of view of the cab, you were in great comfort. Well protected from the weather. Not too hot in the summer. A slight danger of burning your wrists when you fired the back corners of the firebox, because the firebox on a 9F slopes into the cab at an angle that means that when you fire into the back corners, you can easily touch your wrists on some extremely hot bits of metal that surround the fire door. So that was a bit of a problem. And some people wore gloves firing, which was very unusual to actually put gloves under fire. You could sit there with your feet up on the injectors and relax as a fireman once you got the fire right, and you felt yourself in some sort of a heaven for firemen, really.
On a day of sunshine and showers, Dave Gillam has been rostered to drive a 9F for the day, and that's heaven for any driver.
All right, let's wander into forward gear. Okay, we've got the road. Steam brake off, back brake off.
Dave's first stop is at the water column, where you need to come to a halt at just the right spot.
Try and stop it in the right place. There we go, steam brake on, back brake on. Turn the little jet off for the brakes. Wind it back to mid-gear so we don't go anywhere when we're filling up with water. Handbrakes on, cylinder cocks are open. And let's put some water in. Yeah, it's warming up now. Okay, it's a single line token, shop, stick in the holder. Okay, steam brake off, forward gear, back and brakes off. Bit of regulator. Still got the cylinder cocks open at the moment because it's cold and wet.